Well, it's early days yet. I've been to a total of 7 screening interviews all this last week. Talked to a number of district representatives, all who asked the same thing about student teaching. Being who I am, I have to be honest. It's early. I'm still in the pre-student teaching phase of observation. I'm not yet ready with the lesson plan. I've yet to finalize my classroom management techniques, and I still need to work on my opening spiel. But, unsurprisingly, I'm anxious. I'm glad to have these 5 weeks, but I'm ready to take over the class. It's not to say that I'm not learning things during my observation. My days at school generally consist of arriving early, settling in, checking in with Mr. Longstreet about what we will be doing that day, and I have, surprisingly, had a number of opportunities to sit on some parent-teacher conferences, as well as a couple referral meetings as they get the process started, putting together an IEP for one of the students. Having the first 2 periods of the day free for planning is a little weird. But it's also extremely nice because it'll allow me some time to prepare the classroom as well as myself before the day begins. So generally, Mr. Longstreet and I talk about random things before his 3rd period class arrives. We talk about teaching in general. He mentioned how he's met Harry Wong. We go over some specifics about grades and attendance and software and things like that. And just last week, we finally hammered out exactly what SOLs I will be covering. I think this is what worried me the most, pacing. Now, I'm still not entirely happy with my pacing for the 9 weeks. The 9 weeks I'll be student teaching, and my curriculum mat definitely needs some work. But I'm getting there. Instead of 4 SOLs, I'll be focused on 3. And sure, the last one is on economics, and not exactly something I'm super confident about, but I think it's actually a good thing, because it'll allow me some time to space things out and maybe focus a little bit more on something that may require it. So, things are a bit awkward at school right now. They're finishing up the first half of the year, transitioning to the second half, and of course, me, in these classes at least. There's just so much administrative stuff, and pretty much Mr. Longstreet's the only one who can deal with it. So he's been giving students a lot of time to work on things in class. And I was intrigued, because the other day he did this thing where he gave students the entire class period to work on what he's called add-on notes. Now basically it's a time where students can go through the textbook, their various handouts, which he provides, and make notes for themselves. I walked around a little bit, trying to notice how their writing is, and B, just kind of what they're doing. And I noticed a couple of really interesting things. First, most students are copying directly from the handout or the textbook. Graphic organizers and all. They're replicating everything down to the last drop, which is cool. The repetition is good for them, but there's very little independent thought involved here. I mean, he wants them to put things into their own words, but they seem to be like me when I was their age, where I would put everything but one word in their own words, and just the key word would be something a little bit different. And this really got me thinking, how important is it to provide for not only models and frames and hooks for developing good study and organizational habits, but how important is it to provide time in the classroom during class periods to work on these things? And is that something that should be graded and or assessed? Now, the other thing that really interests me were there were a few students, very few, who would actually use highlighters. And Mr. Longstreet encouraged and praised this kind of behavior. There was one student in particular who, at the top of her sheet, had 3 different highlights, and then next to it, what the highlight portions meant. So, this is the part that I need to study. This is the part that I may need to review. This is the part that, X, Y, Z. So I was really impressed because that wasn't something that I developed at that time. So note-taking independently has not been a strong suit of mine. And I kind of wish I had developed that habit earlier, so I'm happy to see students are doing this now. It also got me thinking, is this something I can do with Digo and maybe try to encourage some digital literacy? But then I wondered, 7th graders in Digo, it's something I still have to work out. The other thing that really interested me, disappointed me, was how formalized everything was. They would mark at the top of their pages SOL 7A add-on notes, which, while accurate, perhaps a little too on the nose. And it reminded me of a graduate professor of mine, an English teacher whose class I ended up hating. That he would always say that you need to title everything you write. Everything you write. And this was, he said this referring to some of my, personal reflection journals on readings and things like that. And of course, while I didn't like the class, I kind of taken this to heart. Sometimes a little too cleverly when it comes to my blog titles, but I title everything. And I wonder if there's something in there that we should be emphasizing with students as well. Because not only would it encourage them to read over their notes again, but also kind of summarize it. So, keeping the SOL as 7A add-on notes, but what's the title? What's the key concepts or ideas, and how can I phrase that? So there's a lot to consider there. I think what made my week, though, was the way I was slowly getting involved. Although we never really talked about it ahead of time, Mr. Longstreet, I think, understands that I'm not exactly the kind of person who likes to mirror teach. I like control. Not for the sake of control, but anyway. So my observation has been primarily about seeing how the students interact with each other and trying, albeit slowly, to learn student names and to see what I can borrow from, steal outright, alter, or try something completely different from what Mr. Longstreet does. During a recent lecture on state government, I found a way to speak up in the class. And I could sense that students were interested in this. At one point he asked, how many students were born outside of Virginia? And I raised my hand. And when he came to me, I wouldn't come out and say it straight out. I would say, you know what, I'm from the Cornhusker State. And almost always they got it right away. But it gave them a chance to kind of involve in the Socratic method where you don't actually give the answer, but you kind of encourage students to think for themselves and whatnot. And then later in the same lesson, we were talking about bicameral legislature, and we'd been doing a good job of showing how parallel the federal and state governments are without really providing any good contrast. And I was like, well, you know what? Nebraska, unicameral. So sure, it was maybe a little bit trivial, but you know what? Students are kind of like that idea. Well, Mr. Pedersen's home state is different from ours in X, Y, and Z, and it's kind of cool there. So, and most importantly, I think what I came to realize and what I've been telling the recruiters this last week has been, I'm kind of surprised by my school experience. For a long time, I built up this idea that I wanted to teach well-educated college students who were interested in theology and religion and everything else. And then I was like, well, you know what? High school aren't that different from college students. I can handle that. There was just kind of a stigma attached to middle school. Stay away. They're too crazy and hormonal and everything else. But you know what? I'm loving working with these kids. We'll see how I feel in a few weeks. But you know what? I'm looking forward to it right now. So we'll see what comes next.